Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to this talk. Oops. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to go right ahead. My talk is tentatively titled Graphematic Chineseness as Intertextual Discourse in the West. And this is still at the very early stage of a relatively large project. But I don't want to miss this opportunity to run some rough ideas by this audience, which is, I think, a really special opportunity to have. So I will be looking forward to your comments and questions. The Chinese characters, Chinese writing system, or Hanzi, has been integral to the construction of visual Chineseness in the West. I use the term graphematic Chineseness to refer to the deployment of Chinese characters, character-like glyphs, and synthesized Latin lettering to evoke the Chinese ethno-cultural identity in non-Chinese context. So this project explores how these typographic graphematic forms have long played a key role in the historical production of Chineseness in the West. These forms should be understood, I argue, not as isolated stylistic inventions, but as an intertextual discourse that has unfolded, sedimented, and reactivated across centuries. So, drawing on intertextuality theory, the study conceptualizes graphematic Chineseness as a repertoire of recurring grapholinguistic citations through which Western societies have continuously imagined, negotiated, and contested China as an other, while prior scholarships has often treated such forms as Orientalist stereotypes or semiotic indexes. This project reframes them as intertextual signs, that is, graphic utterances that acquire meaning through repetition, recontextualization, and dialogic reaction to earlier texts and images. It treats grapholinguistic forms as participating in a historical chain of references in which no single instance is originary. Each new inscription cites, transforms, or contests prior representations of Chineseness, even when designers or audiences lack explicit awareness of those precedents. In terms of methodology, the project combines visual discourse analysis, social semiotic examination, and historical contextualization with a focus on graphematic form, layout, and circulation. So the data I'm looking at include imperfect and fabricated Chinese characters in Jesuit and early modern European writings on China, made-up characters in chinoiserie architectural and decorative arts, Chinese mimicking lettering styles, and early synthesized Latin letter forms in 19th century American and British political cartoons, and finally, modern deployments of the chop suey lettering style in political discourses and popular media. So I will focus on a few examples for each of these categories. So first, Jesuit and early modern European writings. This group of images was created as illustrations in several of the earliest comprehensive reports on China written by Western scholars. Among them, China Illustrata and an embassy from the East India Company served as a major source of reliable information on China, available to Western Europeans at the time. So both of them contained dedicated discussions of Chinese characters and used character forms in their illustrations. However, these characters are often rendered incomplete or incorrect, as shown in this figure here. In 1A, the character Yu in E, which means jade, and the character shown in F, which means to give birth to, were both written to look the same as this character in the bottom, which means king, it's read as Wang. Okay. You may ask, how do I know which is which? If you read the text, you will know. Okay, just take my word for it. Yes. So here's another example. In B, the two characters Xi and Long had either missing or misplaced strokes, as you can compare and see fairly easily. And here's another example. The characters Feng Huang, which is the name of the bird, phoenix, had also either missing or misplaced strokes as well. Nonetheless, the Chinese characters in these examples were best efforts to approximate the intended Hanzi forms. In fact, they're still readable if you just read the text along with it. Okay. So by contrast, in this figure D, we see made-up character forms arranged vertically to suggest inscriptions on architectural columns or on the side of a constructed platform. Okay. So these are not actual or real characters anymore. And E is a similar example where made-up characters were arranged vertically on ceremonial tablets. As we will see, this practice of this kind of practice will continue through history and until modern times. Despite the imperfect or made-up character forms, discussions of the Chinese script in Newhoff and Kirsch's volumes suggested an attitude of appreciation and even admiration for the complexity of the Chinese script and the people who used it. Both of them commented on the great number of Chinese characters and the diligence and capability required of their learners. Their perception of the Chinese people, or at least the Chinese ruling class or educated class, as diligent and learned, was closely associated with their understanding of the Chinese writing system. And this understanding was also consistent with that of the earlier Jesuit writers, such as Matteo Ricci and Nicholas Trigal. On the Christian mission among the Chinese, the volume Trigal compiled based on Ricci's journal, they touched upon the Chinese educational system that emphasized memorization of thousands of characters to highlight the rigorous scholarly culture of the time. Ricci and Trigal also understood or misunderstood the Chinese script as an ideographic writing system, and they emphasized the visual nature of Chinese characters, noting the script's capacity to transcend spoken dialects across different linguistic regions. And they speculated about its potential as a universal language in writing. Following a similar line of thinking, Kircher also speculated incorrectly that Chinese writing descended from Egyptian hieroglyphs. Like Ricci and Trigal, Kircher believed Chinese characters encoded ancient truths and had hidden theological meanings. For example, referring to the characters 10, meaning 十 meaning 10, 土 meaning earth, Wang meaning king, and Yu meaning jade and gem. Kircher says, certainly the cross is often seen in the Chinese characters, and this also has a great honor among the Egyptians. And I'm skipping some lines here. And all three characters indicate some degree of perfection. And so it is appropriate that they are made by means of a cross. Such interpretation aimed to find traces of Christian theology within the Chinese script, suggesting in the Jesuits' conceptualization a shared divine origin between Chinese and Western civilizations. Kircher believed that the Chinese civilization, including its writing system, was a deviation from a universal Christian heritage. This viewpoint framed China not as an alien culture, but as a prodigal son that had strayed from the original divine path. And the Jesuits were there to rediscover it and teach the Chinese about it, obviously. Yes. So the analysis demonstrates that early European encounters with Chinese writing positioned characters intertextually alongside hieroglyphs and sacred scripts. Jesuits and Enlightenment texts cited an imagined lineage of ancient wisdom and universal truth, framing China as culturally distant, yet spiritually legible to the West. These early citations established a visual vocabulary, vertical arrangement, dense strokes, inscrutability, that is, you can't read it, that later designers would reuse with diminishing concern for linguistic accuracy. So now let's move on to the second group of images, which is examples of chinoiserie decorative arts, popular among the aristocratic class in Europe, starting from the mid to late 17th century. Chinoiserie is a European style based on Western interpretation and imitation of Chinese aesthetics. It was developed under the direct influence of the works by Kircher, Neuhoff, and others, and was fueled by growing trade between China and Europe. Figure 2 shows one such example. In image A, Neuhoff depicts several Chinese priests and monks in different styles of clothing. The most visually striking of them is perhaps the one cross-legged seated figure in the center, wearing this supersized piece of accessory on his head. It was incorporated as a decorative component into an elaborately constructed table clock about half a century later. Strange as the figure appeared in Neuhoff's illustration, still stranger is the one sitting under the clock. Indeed, chinoiserie artifacts are often product of a quote-unquote a twice removed gaze that reduced and flattens visual Chineseness to distorted mimicry. So also borrowed from the writings by Kircher, Neuhoff, and so on was the use of made-up Chinese characters in architectural design and decoration. D and E are images of a structure known as the Chinese house, constructed in 1738 here in England. Characters on the edge of the building facade appear Chinese, but they are not actual Chinese characters. As another example, F shows the magnificently designed Chinese palace built in southern Italy half a century later. One can count the number of characters, quote-unquote characters, in each section of the couplet, but would not be able to comprehend most of them individually or to understand the meaning of a couplet as a whole. Okay. So now we can compare the first group and the second group. In Kircher and Neuhoff's illustrations, such characters suggested a Chineseness that was ancient, vast, and sophisticated, a civilization that the West admired and even tried to incorporate into their core belief system. Most of the Chinese characters in their works were actually real. Although they were often imperfectly formed, given contextual knowledge provided in the text, they were still pronounceable and comprehensible. In the context of an imagined China as an exotic, faraway land, made-up Chinese characters no longer linked to actual linguistic units of the Chinese speech. They were no longer pronounceable or comprehensible. Instead, they represented a vague and vacuous or empty Chineseness. In other words, fabricated characters no longer referenced actual Chinese graphemes, but rather cited earlier European images of quote-unquote Chinese writing, producing a self-referential intertextual loop. Chineseness has emerged no longer from China itself, but from accumulated Western representation of China. Okay, now let's look at the third group. If the taste of chinoiserie constructed the Chineseness desirable to many in the West, then this next group of images dramatically changed that evaluation and representation. They are American and British political cartoons published in the Chinese exclusion era from the late 19th to early 20th century. In this first example, we see three characters, Chang Yi Lang, presented in the familiar vertical format in the plaque, contain several imperfections, but one may still recognize the character forms and understand their meaning, which is something like a corridor of enduring goodness. The cartoon depicted a large group of Chinese migrants gathered to gamble during the Chinese New Year. If the image itself is not clearly pejorative, then its caption certainly makes it clear. The heathens Christmas, right? The word heathen is used in a derogative way to refer to someone who is not religious, especially who does not believe in the God of the Bible, and who is uncultured or uncivilized. Amidst the height of anti-Chinese sentiment on the American West Coast, Chineseness as otherness took on a whole host of different meanings compared with centuries ago in the perception of educated Europeans. Rather than seeking theological affinity with the Chinese civilization, as Kirsch and Neuhoff did in the 17th century, this cartoon used the three large characters prominently displayed to suggest cultural dissonance and spiritual incompatibility between the Chinese and the American whites. Such indexicalities were reinforced by racist representations of the Chinese in other political cartoons published in the same and other similar magazines. So B depicts a quote-unquote many-handed but soulless, evil-looking Chinese destroying the livelihood of the working whites. The bottom section of C suggests rather straightforwardly that the Chinese were less evolved than pigs. In the 19th century, the pre-established intertextual repertoire was reactivated under radically different socio-political conditions. Anti-Chinese cartoons in the United States reused established visual tropes, but infused them with new ideological content, including racial threat, moral deviance, and civilizational incompatibility. Crucially, this period saw a graphematic shift from Chinese characters to Sinicized Latin letters, which I will talk about next. This first image is a double-spread cartoon published in the same magazine, The Wasp, in 1880, depicting a fictional takeover of San Francisco by the Chinese in the year 1900, which is 20 years after. And the second image is the cover of a book, a novel written by P.W. Dooner on the same fictional theme. So we can put these together. They were part of a broader campaign by West Coast labor leaders and nativists to stir racialized fear of Chinese domination that eventually led to the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. The book and the cartoon were a speculative look into the future from the perspective of their current day. They depicted a fictional dystopian San Francisco that had been taken over by the Chinese. As we see in the cartoon, Chinese men and women were depicted as dominant figures, occupying important government positions, well-dressed and leisurely. American white men and women are shown in subordinate roles, for example, as vendors and shoe cleaners. Despite the graphematic shift from Chinese characters to Roman letters, the indexicalization of Chineseness was still continuous. The lettering style still mimicked the look of Chinese characters. The layout was still in vertical columns to be read from right to left. And in the case of the book cover, the presentation still imitated the layout of a traditional couplet. The letters were composed of squiggly strokes, making the text difficult to read. This lack of readability still indexed a Chineseness that was incomprehensible and incompatible with the Western mainstream culture. So therefore, I would argue that the graphematic transition does not break the intertextual chain, rather it intensifies it. And later on, we will see chop suey letter forms, and I think what we are looking at right now is a proto chop suey letter form, which functions as readable English, while visually citing the accumulating history of quote-unquote Chinese script imagery, showing allowing hostility to circulate more efficiently among non-Chinese readers. So I would further argue that intertextuality explains both continuity and contradiction in the meaning-making attached to graphematic Chineseness. Across time, similar graphematic forms have indexed admiration, exoticism, ridicule, and geopolitical anxiety. These shifts represent not ruptures, but dialogic rearticulations within a shared intertextual field. All right, now let's look at the last group. The chop suey lettering style in contemporary political discourse. So if you ever did a Google search of Chinese-looking fonts today, you will likely see something like this. It's a almost infinite variety of chop suey fonts, characterized with wedge-shaped strokes. These are typically arranged following the Western horizontal left to right layout. The images in this group illustrates that while Western conception of Chineseness continue to change, old themes may re-emerge in meaning making through ethno-scriptal indexicalization. The idea of China as a threat was prevalent when China was under Western imperialist attack. Shown in this first image is a French cartoon depicting European powers tearing China apart. This was in the 1900. And then in this second image, Awakening of China hangs like a sword of Damocles over the heads of nations involved in tearing China apart. The date was 1901. After the Boxers' uprising, imperialist powers competing in China grew concerned that China's humiliation might provoke a national awakening, one that could pose a serious threat to Western interests. In the third and most recent image, the narrative of threat re-emerged as China became seen as a peer competitor by the US. Shown in image C is an internet meme circulating on conservative websites in the United States during the 2020 presidential campaign. It depicts Joe Biden as a candidate unwilling to deal with the China threat, heightening both the threat itself and the lack of a qualification on Biden's part as a candidate. So the notion of China as a threat is indexed by the use of the chop suey letter form on the words Beijing Biden, along with imageries of a Biden dressed in a Chinese military uniform. As we see, contemporary political memes using chop suey lettering implicitly cite 19th century exclusionary graphics, even as they respond to 21st century anxieties about China's rising global status. Okay, so now to conclude, this study demonstrates that first, graphematic meaning making emerges over time through citation and repetition, not merely through in the moment form function correspondence or semiotic indexicality. And secondly, it shows how graphematic forms can be visually detached from linguistic competence, yet still remain semiotically and socially powerful, as in the case of fabricated Chinese characters. Thus, it highlights the ethical and political stakes of graphematic intertextuality, revealing how graphic traditions can naturalize racialized knowledge over long historical times. Ultimately, again, I argue that graphematic Chineseness in the West is best understood as an intertextual discourse, one that continues to shape visual culture, linguistic landscapes, and geopolitical imagination today. Thank you.
I would ask, I need to speak people, I can move around with my roaming microphone. And start on this end. Okay, let's see, that works.
Hello.
There we go, try again.
Okay. So my question is about the chop suey font. I'm really fascinated by this index treatment, and intertextuality is great. I find it interesting that you didn't interesting in a positive way that you didn't go for appropriation. But my question is about the reversing, what do you call it? Reverse importing. When I work on Japanese and I did some work with the chop suey font, but I did not do any work with the chop suey font. I had some undergraduates I asked them to make some materiality stuff, and the English student felt chop suey is racist, and a Japanese student produced some work using it because for him it expresses the Japaneseness of the material he was working with.
Yeah.
So we have, when these motifs get re-imported back into country of origin, these things can change. And I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts on that with China and across.
Yes. Thank you for this question. It's really fascinating. So I actually did work on the chop suey font on a separate project, which is part of this overall project. And so over the years, I've been collecting chop suey examples. I have so far a database of about 600 something images from all over the world. You can find them everywhere, including in Asia itself. However, the great majority, I would say 95% or more, will be outside of East Asia. And the occasional examples I run into that are located in Asia were actually Western-related examples. For example, there is an American school in Taiwan, and in their yearbook in 1965, on the cover, they use the chop suey font. And there is a bar, very popular bar among the expats in Hong Kong, and the name was rendered in chop suey. So I'm curious to talk to your students and to find out, especially your Japanese students, what motivated him to use chop suey to indicate the Japanese identity. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
We'll do it that way.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the talk, which I enjoyed greatly. Just to, I'd love to hear more about intertextuality and why it is your central keyword. I'm thinking that there are other possible candidates, such as stylization. Intertextuality suggests to me some kind of trajectory, and I'm not always sure where the trajectory comes from exactly. But that's kind of something to talk about. In order for maybe it would be a useful reference for you and maybe for others, just to situate the idea of stylization more broadly. That there is a fantastic article by Andrew Nagle, Nagle. I can provide references once I have connectivity, about the use of stylized scripts in Renaissance painting by people like Jan van Eyck, which are kind of stylized Arabic and Hebrew. For example, some painters used stylized fake Arabic to indicate the status of represented participants as saints or people from the East, like the Three Kings or something like that. So there is what I'm trying to say is that the idea of using different scripts, not as code switching, but something that Ben Rampton has called code crossing, when it's not a language you know or legitimately own, like tourists saying snippets of local languages when they travel abroad. It's a broader universe, which I think maybe would be useful for you to situate your own study, which is fantastic, in a sort of broader frame of what happens with scripts. Thanks.
All right. I guess this book project is turning into like a multi-volume project. But thank you, Adam.
Thanks.
So in regard to your question about intertextuality, to be honest, I'm still reading the theory in this area, and my idea was I in fact started out studying the chop suey typeface as my focus, but then it struck me that the representation of Chineseness in graphematic form in the West did not start with chop suey. It actually went all the way back in the very, very beginning. And then there has to be this historical continuity. And then how do we understand the connections, especially given that chop suey is, we're talking about Latin letters, but then the earlier representations included Chinese characters. So these are very distinct scripts. What's the connection? So that's why I thought this could be understood as a long-lasting dialogue among the creators of meanings using semiotic resources. They are, referencing each other, borrowing ideas from each other, and so it keeps going and evolving. And then when the circumstances provides the right moment, it's brought into circulation and starts circulating again. So that's my conceptualization so far, but definitely I'll be really curious to find out more about the stylization.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yanni?
Thank you for that very inspiring talk. My question may be naive, but has there been some symmetric side? So, for example, how was Marco Polo depicted in Chinese documents, or how was Westerners graphically depicted in Chinese newspapers of the 19th century? Is there a symmetry somewhere?
Yeah. So that's the other side of the mirror that I haven't dared to look at. There has been, of course, historical depiction of foreigners since really, really early on. If you look at Han Dynasty murals, for example, or Tang Dynasty pottery, you will see Western figures, or at least people from the Middle East.
But are they as distorted as chinoiserie in the 19th century, 18th century?
I would say not exactly. Chinoiserie is actually a Western invention. It's a European creation because Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, tea, all these things were really popular among Europeans, but they're really expensive. So as trade developed, such commodity became highly prized. And along with it, the aesthetics of Chinese culture became really sought after. I believe it was believed to be Louis XIV who started this whole trend, and he decorated the Versailles all in the Chinoiserie style. There was a portion of it, at least, and apparently the arrival of the 1900, I think, or 1800, I got my centuries wrong, was celebrated when the Louis XIV was, dressed in Chinese clothing, and the whole court was dressed in Chinese clothing, and they were enacting this Chinese spectacle. So anyway, that tells you how important this aesthetic was, or how desired, I guess. But back to your question of the depiction of non-Chinese in Chinese culture, I haven't looked much into it, but in general, Marco Polo and the Jesuits were held in high regard in Chinese cultural political narrative. I teach at Loyola Marymount University, which is a Jesuit university. And when I took my colleagues to visit Beijing, and we were taken to see Matteo Rissi's tomb in Beijing. And he's, in fact, his tomb now is located in the Beijing Communist Party school campus. And so there we were, you had Communist Party members welcoming us onto their own campus and telling us about the Jesuit history. So that shows you something about the perception of these Jesuit scholars in the Chinese tradition. Hopefully that's something.
Thank you.
Another question? Hold on, wait, come close. Your finger online. Continue.
Just for the as a little comment to the last question, I could add that in Japan you for a very short time have something kind of symmetrical. There's in like mid 19th century, so when there's a keen interest in the Dutch in Nagasaki, but not yet the full opening of all those ports. There's a few very interesting artworks depicting Dutch people and so on that even integrate faux alphabetic writing, where you have very nicely imitated, essentially Latin cursive script, but you can't read it. It doesn't mean anything, and it's probably the best equivalent to chinoiserie, but because of the power imbalance of colonialism, that didn't last very long, and 20 years after that, people were trying to really learn English and French and so on. So that's maybe something you can look at if you're looking for like the reverse example.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you so much for that. Although I have to say that the relation between Japan and the West was very different from the relation between China and the West. And I think that played a role in how the two parties see each other. Yeah.
I think this is a good point to stop, Billy. Thank you very much for this presentation.